For the past 9 months, I've been working on a map. Ever since TF2 added support for in-game cameras and monitors, I've had the idea to make a map fully centralized around that idea, letting one team watch cameras and close doors while the other tries to sneak past. But over time, what started as a map intended to test out TF2's new feature turned into a fully fledged minigame heavily inspired by Five Nights at Freddy's. So to celebrate the release of the movie and a belated Halloween, I've gotten this project into a state that is for all intents and purposes finished. This is the greatly improved version of my Five Nights at Freddy's map, CP_FNAF. The map is a fully playable variant of the Attack Defend game mode meant to simulate the look, feel, and gameplay of the first Five Nights at Freddy's game as close as physically possible. Obviously, some concessions had to be made considering how different the games are at their core, but I think I nailed everything as well as I possibly could have provided what I had to work with in TF2's engine. I have made a video on this map before, but a lot has changed since then, so I should run through how the map is generally supposed to work. The attackers are the animatronics. All of them play as a melee-only heavy with a slower movement speed, but enough damage to one-shot most classes. The animatronics start on the party stage and have to make their way through the restaurant and get to the sole capture point located in the security office. Just like FNAF, if an animatronic is in the office for long enough, they instantly win the round. Pretty simple. The defenders act as the security guards who are trying to keep the animatronics out of the office. They're allowed to play as any class, albeit with stripped down firepower in some cases just to keep things fair. Like you'd expect, their main goal is to survive until 6 AM, or in TF2 terms, defend until the timer reaches 0. So at its core, CP FNAF is just a smaller scale attack defend map with more class and weapon restrictions meant to encourage a specific type of play. However, each team also has a unique mechanic built into the map that gives them their own advantages that they benefit immensely from taking advantage of. Defenders have cameras and doors that can be operated from the complete safety of the office. Scattered throughout the restaurant are 8 different cameras that defenders can check whenever they want, letting them monitor the entire map without exposing themselves to any sort of danger. Defenders can also close doors to block off certain parts of the map, giving them much more control over the way they choose to defend. Outside of the doors that protect the office, though, they can only have one door closed at a time, meaning they have to actively be checking cameras and closing the right door for the situation to get the most use out of their main defense. But if defenders could just close both doors and hide in the office, how are the attackers ever meant to win? In Five Nights at Freddy's, the problem with this strategy is that you'd very quickly run out of power, so to emulate this, the attackers are able to forcibly turn off the power by completing a few side objectives located around the map. There are 2 buttons that have to be pressed before you can turn off the power, one located on the east side of the map and one located on the west. Once both buttons are pressed, the door in the basement opens up to expose the main breaker. All the animatronics then have to do is deliver a single punch to it, which causes the power to immediately go out for the entire restaurant. When the power goes out, all of the lights in the map turn off and the defenders are placed at a massive disadvantage. They can't see very far in front of them, making it much easier to get ambushed. All the doors are forced open and disabled, which gives animatronics multiple straight pathways to the office that can't be blocked, and in order to turn the power back on, they have to leave the relative safety of the office and go to one of the more claustrophobic parts of the map to press a button. Overall, this makes camping in the office a horrible strategy, since without proper defense, attackers are able to freely turn off the power whenever they want and immediately kill everyone inside the office once the doors open. Outside of that, there are a few more miscellaneous mechanics that add some flavor to the map, but we will get to those later. So that's a quick summary of how the map works, so now let's talk about the layout. If you know a lot about the original game, you'll probably notice that there's a lot of extra rooms in the TF2 version that seem to be pulled out of nowhere. While I wanted to make the map as accurate to the source material as I could, pretty much all the new additions are necessary for the game to flow smoothly. While the animatronics in FNAF are all managed by a CPU, the attackers in this game obviously have human intelligence. Instead of just aimlessly wandering around the restaurant, they're going to immediately beeline it to the office the second the round starts. So I think it's safe to say that directly recreating the original restaurant layout one-to-one would not be in our best interest here. Instead, the layout that I decided to run with is this one, which splits the attacking routes up into 2 distinct paths. The east path has you exit the dining area into the restaurant's storage room, which happens to be where the first power button is located. Ignoring doors, this is the fastest route to the office, since beyond the storage area lies a short hallway that leads directly to the point. Alternatively, you could take the flank route, leaving spawn through an open vent in the restroom that eventually lets you drop down into the hallway mentioned earlier. Though this does give you the element of surprise, there are several points where defenders can take free pot shots on you, making it much riskier if they know you're coming. Both of these routes obviously let the attackers get to the point extremely quickly though, so to counteract this, defenders have 3 separate ways of closing this area off. The west path to the office starts by leaving spawn and entering into the kitchen, which connects to this cellar that contains the power on button. Behind the cellar is the maintenance room, which is where the second power button exists, and beyond that is the hallway that leads to the office with a small side room which connects to a flank route. This is the slightly longer of the 2 routes, but due to the much more closed-in nature of some of the rooms, it does have certain advantages both to attack and to defend. So those are the main 2 routes, but there are a few other rooms of note that constitute a sort of secret flank route that either team can access from the defender side of the map. Breaking these wooden planks in the hallway outside of spawn opens up the basement, which is where the attackers want to go after pressing both of the buttons to open up the power door. By default, the basement is closed off from the rest of the map, but by pressing the button on this control panel here, you open the shutters, allowing for a complete route to form. The purpose of this route is to 1, give attackers a way to shift the map in their favor if that side of the map is left unattended for too long, and 2, to give defenders a last-ditch option to prevent the power from going out if both buttons have already been pressed. Ultimately, it ends up as a niche but fairly versatile route that both teams can take advantage of if the time is right. And finally, there's a vent in the center that connects both halves of the map, giving attackers a way to cross to the other side that doesn't involve walking all the way back to spawn. And of course, including the office that lies at the end of both routes, that's the entirety of the layout. It's a pretty basic figure 8 configuration with a few flank routes, but I think it works pretty well for a smaller game mode like this. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, I've been making CP FNAF on and off for the past past 9 months, which has led to quite a few distinct versions of the map piling up on my computer. Each version represents a state of the map saved right before I decided to change something major. What's neat is that when these versions are viewed one after another, there's a sort of story that starts to form about the development of the map. So I want to go through a few snippets of how this map was made, looking at how I gradually refined the layout, mechanics, aesthetics, and everything else that makes it what it is now. Before I compare the versions though, there is something that I want to discuss that you'll probably find pretty interesting. I get asked what stuff like B5, RC2, and other similar map suffixes mean quite a bit. As I implied, it's pretty good practice to create a new file of your map before changing anything major just in case you need to revert it later. It would be a headache to have 30 files with identical names though, so typically map makers will denote the version of the map with the file name itself. In the case of most of the versions that I'll be showcasing today, such as CP FNAF B1, B stands for beta, which is usually when the bulk of the testing occurs, and 1's the revision of the beta being tested. As you may expect, beta versions come after alpha versions, which are typically labeled with A's instead of B's. Usually the alpha version of the map development is done before any design in order to test the layout, with gray developer textures acting as placeholders for the actual aesthetics to be added later. After beta comes the first release candidate, or RC1, in which a good majority of the map's design is completely settled, but a few tweaks may need to be made to the map's layout before the final release. And then of course there's final, which is the one that you'll see on a lot of official maps since it indicates that the map is for all intents and purposes complete with no more changes planned. Now, sometimes mappers will deviate from this and just make versions ending with V. The V literally just stands for version and is in my opinion a much more rudimentary way of labeling releases, so I prefer not to use it personally. But if you're making a map that you don't plan on editing much after the first release, it can work if you need it to. So there's a bit of trivia for the few of you that are wondering why maps are labeled in the way that they are. I personally find systems like that interesting, so hopefully you do too. Anyway, back to the map, let's start at square one and work our way down the versions. This is the first version of the map that I tested, which I labeled CP FNAF B1. The way that this map started out is with incredibly cramped rooms containing largely default TF2 textures. Despite the map name, the original intent of this map was supposed to be vaguely inspired by FNAF rather than a direct reference, so most of what I did was styled after TF2 because it's what I had on hand. You can easily see that this was pretty early on in development though. A lot of the original rooms were super small, which mostly stemmed from me not having a very good grasp on the scale for a game mode like this. None of the cameras and doors were labeled, meaning that you just kind of had to figure out what everything did if you were playing for the first time. And most of the rooms were completely devoid of detail, being boxes meant to test the layout rather than proper environment design. And it seems like the people who first helped me test this map agreed that the things that I mentioned were problems, since right after that I created CP FNAF B2 with adjustments based on the feedback. This is the version shown off in the first video that I made on the map if you're curious. Previously, microscopic rooms like the kitchen and the office were expanded to make actual combat a bit more feasible, the doors were moved to better cover the routes attackers actually tended to take, and everything on the camera panel now had text pop up to show you what you were pressing. But despite the changes, the main complaint that I continued to get was that everything just felt cramped. It took attackers no time at all to reach the office, and the stealth they were intended to have was moot considering how easy it was for defenders to bump into them while cloaked. The first change that I made to address this was adding an event that connected both halves of the map, which worked fine for what it did, but ultimately left the main issues unresolved. So for CP FNAF B3, I expanded the map as much as I possibly could. Nearly every single room was made significantly larger, as well as being a bit more decorated, making the map feel a lot more complete than it previously did. The door in the basement, which previously only existed as a way for attackers to quickly rush the office after turning the power off, was changed to be button operated. The benefits of this became immediately clear as I discussed in the intro, giving attackers a new flank route with the right timing and defenders a way to stop power outages right before they happened. I also replaced a lot of breakable vents with these fans, which instead of being destroyable could be shot through by either team. The intent of that was both for sneaky spies to be able to turn off the power from a distance with their revolver, while also letting defenders take pot shots on attackers who were being obvious using the flank routes. Overall, this change worked pretty well in the earlier versions, but ultimately the fans ended up being more of a cool map detail than anything meaningful. But the last and one of the more subtle changes made in this version was to the lighting, because one of the largest challenges I've continually faced while making this map is that Source is an ancient engine. In order to have the lights turn off, I have to give them a custom name so that the button you press to turn them off knows what to target. But for whatever reason, giving lights a custom name in the Source engine makes them no longer bounce off of surfaces. Normally when you put a light in a room, it'll illuminate a lot more than what's in its direct line of sight due to the specular light reflecting off the walls and the ceiling. The shaded areas will be slightly darker, sure, but they should not be pitch black like they are here. Assuming I wanted to keep the power out mechanic, which I obviously did, there isn't really any way to fix this other than just adding a bunch more lights to cover the darker areas. It did remove a bit of the spookiness that I wanted the map to have, but it made things a lot more visually tolerable, so it was the best option that I had at the time. The B3 version of this map also got a few sub-versions made for testing random things, mainly changing stuff like making the interactables more user-friendly, adding a new door that blocks the flank routes, and sloping off the roof to prevent this strategy.
They're just in the corner.
Yeah, what are they doing? They're just like...
It's actually broken. It's actually this is actually a nut strat. They broke the game.
And at the time that I made it, I was pretty satisfied with this version of the map and didn't see the need to change anything major. However, after working on the Emesis Blue map for a while, which yes, I still am planning on finishing by the way, I learned two very important things about Hammer. Number one, it is incredibly easy to make a map look spooky with the right lighting, and number two, it is incredibly easy to import whatever custom textures you want. So with the fun that I had making Emesis Blue, I decided to fully commit to making this map as similar to FNAF as I possibly could. The first thing that I changed in CP FNAF B4 to make this a reality was recreating a majority of the layout from the ground up. To quickly run down the major layout changes, the two halves of the map are now completely separated and can only access one side of the office instead of joining at a combined middle area. The office is now FNAFified, looking more like you'd expect the office to look on a FNAF theme map instead of the weird horizontal layout used before. Blue Spawn now has two separate exits that lead into a long hallway to make it harder for the defenders to spawn camp. Blue Spawn itself is a lot larger and now looks like an actual restaurant dining room rather than a side collection of tables and chairs. And finally, instead of the kitchen connecting to the maintenance room by a cramped vent, there's now a much more natural looking cellar area that houses the power on button. Speaking of, the power out mechanic is also much more fleshed out, requiring two separate buttons to be pressed on opposite ends of the map rather than just a single one like it was before. This makes it feel a lot more like a proper side objective rather than just something the attackers can passively do whenever they want. And not only in this version, but throughout the next couple as well, the aesthetics of the map have been upgraded dramatically, but we will get to that later. Overall, B4 was one of the largest changes done to the map, which makes sense considering how long it was between the two versions. As far as the layout is concerned, B5 had next to no changes and B6 only had one, adding a new restroom area onto the side of Blue Spawn that acts as the new entrance to the flank route. And minus some very minor adjustments, that's where the map stands now since I'm pretty satisfied with how everything is arranged. Obviously, future testing might necessitate a few changes here and there, but based on what's been done already, I think this general layout and gameplay loop works as well as it can. So now let's talk about the aesthetics, which is the thing that I focused the most on in the most recent few versions of the map. I think it's pointless to break this down version by version since each revision was largely independent of the design, so let's just talk about everything that I upgraded after the major rework. The most major change you'll notice is that a lot of the walls, floors, and other decorations look a lot more similar to FNAF than what existed previously. As I mentioned, I decided to make the switch from a TF2 styled map to a FNAF styled one, so everything here was recreated by examining most of FNAF's game scenes and recreating the textures as best as I could in Photoshop. I decided not to reference the actual animatronics in any way since I wanted to keep this at least somewhat grounded in TF2's universe. That is, of course, excluding the iconic Celebrate poster in the office because, come on, I had to put this here. The other major thing changed throughout the entire map was the lighting, which I decided to make a lot more moody in order to give the map a spookier atmosphere as originally intended. On top of adding more lights, the reason that I raised the light levels originally is because I was afraid that it would be too hard to see, but with a few subtle tricks that I'll get to later, I found this not to be an issue. I also switched the lighting from the basic light entity to the vastly superior light spot. Don't ask why I was using basic lights before. I'm pretty sure they were intended to be placeholders that just stuck around for a lot longer than intended. Even the rooms that don't use FNAF assets got a few visual overhauls, such as the storage room looking a lot less like a factory and more like a restaurant's back room, and the maintenance area looking a lot more appropriate for the setting. The camera looks a lot better, now displaying information on the actual monitor rather than with sources generic on-screen text. The physical cameras now have a light that turns on when they're actively being monitored, giving attackers a bit more information about a mechanic they had to previously guess on. Whether this will affect gameplay is yet to be determined, but it's a neat detail nonetheless. I also reworked the aesthetics of the power outage, switching from the red emergency lights that I used before to an ambient dim blue light that exists even when the power is turned on. On top of making the map a lot more spooky when the lights are off, this also fixes the issues of certain areas being pitch black due to the lack of light bounces, which is a happy little accident that solved one of the most frustrating issues thus far. And just to give the map that extra little bit of atmosphere, I added a dense black fog to the entire thing to give the feeling of a dark building while still allowing everyone to see what's in front of them. But on top of just the visuals, one of my favorite parts of the redesigned map is the sound. It's important to hear what's going on, so I won't talk over this part and just show you what's happening on screen as you listen. Now's a good time to tab in if you're doing something else.
Victory. ball.
I know these are all pretty basic additions on their own, but combined with the visuals, I think they give the map the exact atmosphere I was going for, and I'm super happy with how it turned out. And with that, we get to the pretty much finished version of the map that I'm showing off today. Though I messed around with map making for many years, this is, for all intents and purposes, the first real map I've ever made. I know that not a lot here is impressive from a technical standpoint, especially once you understand the insanity that a lot of modern map makers are adding to their projects, but for what it is, I'm pretty happy with it. If nothing else, I've learned a lot about making other maps from doing this, and eventually I want to create a few more standard maps for TF2 that have the chance to be added to the actual game. As always, if you have any ideas on ways to improve this map, I would love to hear them. Every time I post a video on CP FNAF, I've gotten some very helpful advice from map-making veterans, so feel free to let me know if anything seems out of place. If you want to play this with your friends, I'm going to be uploading this map and every future release candidate to Game Banana for anyone to download and test. I'll put the intended rules there. Note that one of the biggest things I've yet to add before the final version of the map is done is the VScript that fully enforces them, so for now just play it with people you know that won't cheat. If you do end up playing this map with friends, the only thing that I ask is that you tell me how the rounds go, because the more gameplay testing I get, the better the map is going to end up. And also, if you want to play on any of the old map versions I've shown in this video, including the spin-off map CP Pizzeria, all of them are available on my Patreon for you to download and explore as you'd like. So anyway, that is CP FNAF. Like I said, I'm very happy with how it turned out, even if it's not the most technically impressive thing, so let me know what you think. If you enjoy this video, make sure to like. If you hated this video, I hope you run out of power IRL, and most importantly, have a good one.